We're going to start with Alex Jansen from the University of Toronto, and then we'll have Alec Fraser from King's College London, and then we'll have Abha Thorat Shah from the British Asian Trust, who will be also presenting and commenting on the papers, as well as Eleanor Carter from the Government Outcomes Lab, and Richard Johnson from Bridges Outcome Partnerships. It's going to be a really rich discussion. It's a mix of both academics and practitioners, and so the idea is we're going to kick off, have presentations, briefer presentations from our presenters. I will, as moderator, start the discussion with some questions for our presenters, and then we will invite our audience to join with us. So with this, I will kick off with Alex Jansen.
Good morning, everybody from Toronto. Good afternoon to you. Let me just share my slides with you. There we go. Okay. All right, so as you know, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto here in Canada, and what I'm presenting to you today is a tiny little slice of my broader dissertation project, which is currently in progress. So you're also getting a little bit of the research underway rather than final conclusions. What I want to do today is to talk about the relationship between outcomes contracting and the broader way that governments set up and delegate responsibility for social services. And of course, as you hopefully know when you're here today, we're going to be talking all about employment services, which in New York and increasingly in Toronto get referred to as workforce development services, right? So these are policies that are about intervening in the labor market by trying to change the characteristics of people who are unemployed and underemployed to help them get into work, right? So to me, these are a particularly interesting policy domain to study because these are very popular policies now in many, many countries. They're not always clearly ideologically aligned. Parties across the spectrum can value these policies. And there's a huge variety of ways of implementing these policies. So while there's a lot of research about, trying to figure out what works, my research looks at this from a slightly different angle, and I'm interested in how does the way that those delegated services are responsible, so how does the way that governments contract for employment services, how does that affect who actually gets access to training services, right? And this started from a concern about, well, we know there are groups of people who are marginalized from the labor market. So are these people extra able to access these services, or do they struggle? Right. Well, for today's session on thinking about the role of outcomes-based contracting, my main argument here is that to understand and evaluate outcomes-based contracting, we need to look at the broader way that delegated services are arranged and how that affects the outcomes-based focus of contracts. So I'm drawing on the broader case comparison that informs my research. There are 3 cases at the moment that have very different ways of setting up these services. On the closest to government-run services, we have the Netherlands model under UWV, which is the social insurance agency that delivers insurance support for people who are unemployed. In their model, services are delivered directly by bureaucrats of the state, right? So this is the no contracting model, and while it's not typically outcomes-based in terms of funding, results, of course, are monitored and assessed regularly. In the middle, we have the employment service model of Ontario, Employment Ontario. This is an outcomes-based funding model, but it also contains elements of throughput-based funding. And there is quite a lot of prescription in how providers are to deliver services. And then on the furthest end of the spectrum, New York's workforce development system is the most highly delegated and the one that gives the most flexibility or has the most involvement of non-state actors in delivering services. So the first part of my argument is that if we want to understand how outcomes-based contracting affects who gets access to services, we actually have to take a step back from looking at outcomes and look at how contracts organize the referral of people or the eligibility of people for different workforce development systems. Like a lot of places now, New York has a two-tier welfare system. People who are receiving social assistance from the council have a different system of workforce development to everyone else. They are referred to service providers who must work with them. So this is gives the least flexibility to providers. However, the vast majority of the workforce development system is run by mission-driven organizations, so lots of nonprofits, for-profits too, and social enterprises that have much greater control over who they work with because of the way their contracts are organized. So they tend to take a range of contracts, both from government and from philanthropies, and they make those contracts fit with their existing criteria or existing priorities for who they serve. Sometimes that's about a specific local community, geographically based, and sometimes it's about a group that is particularly marginalized from the workforce. Sometimes it's about organizing training around a particular industry. So for example, there are some organizations that focus on getting people into the trades-based industries and taking them into a pathway towards apprenticeships with a union. There are upsides of this system. These services that are very mission-driven and focused often get very good outcomes, especially in terms of the quality of employment. But if you are an individual who's unemployed, what services you end up with is almost a matter of chance and what you learn about. In contrast, the Employment Ontario system here in Toronto has providers accept all eligible clients, and it incentivizes accepting all eligible clients by funding based on participation as well as on outcomes. So here in Toronto, in contrast to New York, there's much more evenness among what services are available and who gets worked with. So we might say this helps to avoid cream skimming, but there's much less specialization. Oops. Sorry, let me go back to the right slide. Here we go. The other thing that we need to think about when understanding the effects of outcomes-based contracts is, what do contracts specify about what services are delivered? And again, here we see the same pattern. So in Employment Ontario, providers must deliver a set category of services. They have to accept all eligible clients. There is some conversation and tailoring about exactly what services which person will do, but the same services are available throughout the province. In contrast, in New York, services are much more flexible. They're much more targeted at solving particular programs and being mission-driven. So there's a real difference in what kinds of outcomes providers are even trying to achieve in New York compared with Toronto. In contrast, in the Netherlands, where you don't have that outcome-based contracting, government employees can do tailoring within the existing framework of government services, and they're not under pressure to assign people to services like they are in the Employment Ontario model in order to achieve the funding based on throughput. Finally, if we want to think about outcomes in employment, the biggest and probably very obvious lesson from my research speaking with providers in each of these places is that what happens in Toronto is that everyone has the same outcome that they are funded for, which is employment, and then how long does a client stay in employment. In New York, contracts are a little bit more flexible. They come from a range of places. Philanthropies as well as government are incentivizing the employment outcome, but to some extent, the same issue occurs. When those contracts focus only on employment, it's much harder for providers to organize and deliver services that create stepping stones to employment. It's also much harder for providers to work together to get those stepping stones to employment. So some of the big things that came up in my research are that for many people who are trying to get into a good career, trying to get themselves out of poverty, they face a number of barriers before they can do that. Some of those come from other systems. So housing is a very difficult issue. Childcare is another difficult issue. Sometimes it's around being demoralized by repeated engagement with services that don't actually help anyone. So what I have heard from providers across both these cases is that they need to find ways to have outcomes that tackle the steps towards employment and not just the outcome of employment itself. So while I'm not saying that outcomes-based contracting is bad, what I'm saying is we need to think carefully about what we're incentivizing and why in order to make sure that it's not just people who are the closest to the labor market who get the most services. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. We will go right into our next presentation by Alec Fraser from King's College London.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, my name is Alec Fraser. I'm from King's College London. The paper I'm presenting today is a collaborative piece of work which I've produced with my colleagues Deborah Heavenston and Lucas Hobie, who are from the Bern University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. The title of the paper is "The Medium is the Message, Accounting for the Spread of Social Impact Bonds to New Geographies." What we're trying to do with this paper is try and conceptually understand a bit more about why it is that people in different countries get attracted to this idea of the social impact bond, and why it is that they decide to try and implement it in new places. It's a paper very much in development, so we'll see if you think the ideas work or not. I'm very keen to get feedback on what works and what doesn't. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this paper comes from a bigger project, which is led by my colleague Deborah. The title of the project is on your screen there. Essentially, what we're trying to do with our broader project is understand what difference SIB financing makes in active labour market programmes. And we're doing that by trying to compare SIB financed active labour market programmes compared to conventionally financed ones across a series of case studies in different countries. The overall project draws on mixed methods, so we've got qualitative and quantitative data. Today's paper is just drawing on qualitative findings. If you're interested in some of the quantitative elements, my colleague Lucas is giving a talk on Friday morning, which I think you'll find interesting, hopefully, so please do attend that. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as quickly as I can, I wanted to give you a bit of context really on the project. So we're taking a comparative case study approach to look at active labour market programmes across 4 different European countries, and we've got 5 different case studies. So we have 1 in the UK, 2 in the Netherlands, 1 in Switzerland, and 1 in Germany. All of these programmes target marginalised communities and try to get them back into education, training or employment. 4 out of 5 focus on young people, and 1 of the programmes focuses on integrating refugees into the local workforce. As you can see, there are different sizes of programmes, but we think overall they're pretty comparable for our purposes. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this table just very briefly gives you an indication of some of the key informants who we've spoken to in the different countries where we've done our research. And as I say, so that should just give you a flavour of the qualitative data which we're drawing on for this paper. And if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the conceptual element. So what are we actually trying to do with this paper? So I've spent a number of years now doing research on social impact bonds, and I think other people who've done the same thing would recognise that there's a lot of conflicting messages around what SIBs are, what they should be, how we might use them. So people talk about the paradox of social impact bonds, or the shape-shifting nature of SIBs, or the fact that they're chameleonic or strategically ambiguous. So for example, there's a tension between innovation on one hand and evidence-based practice on the other hand. So when we're thinking about SIBs, that they're hard to get a grip of conceptually, I think. What I wanted to do with this paper is maybe move on from that argument or sidestep that argument by thinking about SIBs in a slightly different way. And to do that, I'm drawing on work by Marshall McLuhan, who was a Canadian philosopher writing principally in the middle of the last century. And one of his kind of big ideas is that the medium through which information is conveyed is as important or even more important than the message itself or the information itself. And he argued that the medium or the technology through which ideas are conveyed really change the way in which we think about the world. So, for example, he talked about a shift from an oral culture to a written culture, and how that changed the fact that for millennia, people use their ear as their kind of main way of accessing information. And then as we got mass literacy, we became more of a kind of visual culture, using our eyes more. And then we see in the 20th century the development of televisions, and now the internet. And I think we can all kind of grasp that idea that as media changes, our relationship with information and knowledge also changes. So what I wanted to do was try and use that metaphor, if you like, and ask, well, what if we see the SIB as a medium that changes the way actors who are delivering SIBs maybe think about the world and the way in which they act? So that's the metaphor we're trying to use conceptually for this paper. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm trying to do this on two different levels. So we're looking at the micro level and the macro level. To me, I think that the metaphor probably works better on the micro level, but I'm very keen to see what others think. So an observation really is that sometimes people delivering SIBs can prioritize the SIB mechanism itself ahead of the actual intervention which they're delivering for members of the public. A nice example of this, in our data, we've got data from the first ever Dutch social impact bond, the first ever German one, and the first ever Swiss social impact bond. And what's interesting in all of those cases is when you interview the people who did a lot of work to get this idea into motion and deliver a social impact bond, they all say their primary goal was to do a SIB. It was to deliver a social impact bond rather than to solve a problem of employment. So I think the primary goal is the SIB, and the intervention is secondary in these cases. And I think that's important. And I think one of the things we see is that the interventions are subordinate in some way to the need to make the SIB a success itself in either financial terms or political terms. And I think this leads then to trade-offs by actors in terms of what their professional goals might be, or their responsibilities towards either service users or the wider public, in this kind of desire to just make this SIB work. So we've got the real focus on the SIB itself as opposed to the intervention at times. So that's the argument at the micro level. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think I'm also interested in what this might mean at a macro level if we try and expand this metaphor out. And this perhaps reflects my background as an English researcher, doing lots of research on English social impact bonds over the last few years. I wonder if we're going to describe the SIB or use this metaphor as a medium, what is it a medium of? And I'm suggesting in this paper that maybe it's a medium of financialization. And by financialization, I mean the extension of financialized thinking or financialized technologies into previously non-financialized spaces. And I think this helps explain why the SIB has become institutionalized in the UK, and it has strong government support, which fits with the strong finance sector which we have in this country. So I think that it fits for the UK. I think in the Netherlands, it's more of a mixed picture. I think one of our cases fits to this idea around financialization and the real focus on investor interests. But interestingly, our second case doesn't really fit, where it was clear that the SIB wasn't working there, it was dropped. So it doesn't work too well there. But I think it also helps explain in Germany and Switzerland why I think the idea of the SIB is unlikely to become mainstreamed. I think we see a lot of local political and institutional resistance to this kind of Anglo-Saxon idea around financialization. And I think that might help explain why it is that it's very difficult to get SIBs off the ground in Switzerland and Germany, and also why the nature of the SIB and perhaps the way that actors are linked to each other changes in those settings. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alec. We'll look forward to talking more about some of those issues, important issues that you raised. And now I'm going to actually turn it over to Adam Whitworth from the University of Sheffield. And I apologize, Adam, I missed introducing you at the beginning. You and Eleanor Carter of the Go Lab are co-authors on this work. And so thank you so much for presenting to us.
No problem at all. And Elle's actually going to kick us off.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, Adam and I will be jointly presenting this paper that we're working on called The Endless Experiment, where we'll discuss 2 decades of experimentation in quasi-markets for employment support in the UK. So our starting point really is the challenge of making and managing markets in public services and social programmes. And I've put this photograph in, it's a little bit provocative. It's a photograph of protests on probation contracting in England and Wales. And I wanted to put this in as a bit of a reminder, because I think that sometimes discussions around market stewardship and contracting can feel a little bit dry or distant or abstract. But I think this is really crucial work with very real implications. So these protests arose when government outsourced probation services in England and Wales, and it gave contracts to large private sector firms to run rehabilitation companies. There was some apprehension at the time around the low cost and high risk attached to these contracts. And within 5 years, the contracts had buckled. One provider went bust, and the chief inspector described a shortage of staff, poor performance of contractors, and a breakdown in the relationship between probation officers and offenders. So this is then a very real challenge, how to shape and manage these service markets so that they work well. I think it's important that we acknowledge that when government or donors buy services through contracts, these are not natural or instinctive markets. And Julian Legrand helpfully coined the term quasi-markets. And this is a helpful prompt, I think, that these are not natural or instinctive markets. They're artificial. Prices have to be set. Contracts have to be written. Winning providers have to be selected. We have to oversee performance. The market has to be regulated and maintained. And because of this, markets are no single thing. They're not just one thing, they can take many forms and they're highly varied. Some academic work has in the past lumped markets together as the same outsourcing endeavour. But I think part of our discussion today is around the enormous variation in the way that these markets are made and operate. And I think this speaks to some of the issues that Alex mentioned in her presentation. So there's a lot of variation here. And importantly, when civil servants are now market stewards, this variation in markets can be tinkered with and adjusted. So there are different ways of building markets. And these different market varieties or flavours exert very different pressures on the actors involved. So the work of Jane Gingrich, I think, is really helpful here. And also in the past at this conference, I've presented a paper that talks about the variation in these flavours or varieties of market. But in essence, what we're talking about is how the services are allocated, how they're financed through taxation or user charges, and how access to services is assured. Also, how they're produced through competition and choice will dramatically change the nature of these services, the type of support provided will shift in response. So who is the piper calling the tune is a question that I find helpful in thinking about these different flavors of markets. And broadly, we think there are three types. So there are state-driven markets that really work to increase the power of government to achieve cost efficiency. So these are the state-driven efficient markets. We also see user or consumer-led markets who put users of services in the driving seat and create really strong incentives for producers to deliver high quality provision to meet those user desires. And we also see more producer dominant or producer markets, which allow independent service providers to pursue profit maximization. And our objective in this paper is to trace different quasi-market varieties over time in UK employment support provision and take lessons from how these markets have been structured and managed. We also want to add a bit more detail around the state's objective here. Our studies of UK market making show that actually the imperative of government is not always about efficiency. Sometimes there are different imperatives at the heart of government decision making on this, and so we'll pick into some of that too. So in this table here, we try to set out a framework for investigating these alternative market means and market ends. So in the left-hand column, we identify 6 potential market objectives which might overlay or be in tension with one another. So we can make markets so they enable profit to be achieved by providers. In the middle portion here, we have 4 potential elements of government objectives. So we might want to make markets that prioritize economy. So economy could mean cost cutting, just spending less on inputs, or markets might also be made and built to make a return to Treasury. We can also prize efficiency, efficiency in the delivery of outputs. That might be a market objective. Alternatively, markets might prioritize effectiveness. And the overall achievement of outcomes, the social outcomes, might be prioritized under that type of market. And equity concerns might also be something that animates the way that a market is regulated and takes form. And finally, then we have the user-dominated market, which a purpose of the market might be to put those using and drawing on services at the heart. And then across the top, if they're the different objectives or ends, then across the top we have these different means or these different levers that might be drawn on in trying to steer and steward these markets. So we have quite traditional sort of procedural or rule-based levers, such as standardized procedures or service guarantees. That might be one set of levers that we use to structure and incentivize the way these markets work. We also have a suite of new public management levers, such as targets or key performance indicators. They might be a sticky lever to try and shape these markets. We have market-like incentives and tools. So thinking about how much does price or market share dictate and dominate the way these markets work. This, I think, is where payment by results or payment for outcomes might fit as a key lever. Something that we've really seen escalate over time in the UK. And then we have some democratic levers where service users can exert their own choice and voice when they access services. We've left network and network levers as absent, generally because networks and co-productions are almost always absent when you're talking about the UK Department for Work and Pensions. But I'll pass to Adam, who will give a bit more of a sense of the detail of how we went about populating this table and talk through some of the empirics.
That's great. Thanks so much, Elle. Could you drive us on to the next slide, please, Elle? Great. Thank you. Okay, so what we've done to try and operationalize that analytical framework then is to look at policy documents, the contracted commissioned evaluation reports and academic material to essentially try and score 5 of the UK's main contracted employment programs over the past couple of decades. And these are the 5 programs that we've looked at. So back in the New Labour era, Employment zones and multi-provider employment zones are kind of area-based commission program. Provider-led pathways to work were running in parallel to PES provided pathways to work. That was a disability-focused contracted employment program. The very short-lived flexible New Deal that arrived just before Labour lost power was a kind of balanced of service fee and outcome-based contract and sustainment. And then the arrival of the Conservative-led coalition, a very aggressive payment by results model inside the work program, and running in parallel the more health and disability focused work choice with a much softer design and payment model inside it. So they're the programs that we've looked at over the past 20 years or so. And what we've done is look through that documentary analysis, and we've scored each of those programs according to 3 different dimensions, if you like. So firstly, according to the means, if you like, the program levers that they've sought to use. Secondly, by the ends or the outcomes. So what kind of traction do they look to have, what kind of outcomes do they look to be focusing on of those 4 E's that Ella's talked about: economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity? And then thirdly, in terms of this distinction here that you can see between aspirations, what do the documents seem to suggest the program wanted to do versus the reality? What kind of traction on the ground did they look to have? Okay, so what we can see in this slide here is this focus on means, so the use of different types of program levers that Elle's outlined, and to try and get a sense of whether there's any patterning, any variation, any consistency inside this. These are scored underpinning each of these policy means, and the scale of each of those scores goes to a maximum of 10. So what you can see straight away in terms of aspirations is we see a bit of variation and iteration. So for example, work choice leans more heavily to try and use user voice and choice inside its policy levers. But broadly speaking, they bounce around, but they never really fully utilize all of the kind of policy potential that those levers could collectively have. They never get towards the outside of that radar plot. And if we shift to the right, that becomes even more striking when we go through the commissioned evaluation reports and we look at actually what kind of traction in reality did these policy levers seem to have. Some didn't work quite as intended, some didn't work nearly at all. And so you immediately see shrinkage back towards the center. So there's a great deal of space left in terms of what those policy levers, design levers could have done that isn't coming through in practice. And we see some variation amongst it. I won't go into the detail here, but that's the kind of detail that we want to pull out in the broader research that we're carrying on. Okay, if we go to the next slide then, what we're focusing on here then is the space of ends, if you like, or the space of outcomes. So the extent to which these programs seem to be leaning towards efficiency, effectiveness, equity, and apologies, down the bottom there is economy, but has dropped off the bottom. What we see on the left then is a degree of variation in terms of the aspirations that those programs were seeking to achieve. Some are narrower and some are broader. Some, like Flexible New Deal, are leaning more heavily towards effectiveness, much less so in terms of equity. So we do see a degree of variation, not any great chronological consistency particularly. And when we turn to the right in terms of, okay, in reality on the ground, what looks to have happened when we scour through the documents, we see variation, but we also see sets of groups coming out. So there's an interesting, perhaps, balance or tension as to whether the perfect optimal reality in terms of outcomes could ever be achieved. And I'll come back to that in the discussion slide. Broadly, we see one axis like work choice moving horizontally between equity and effectiveness, delivering more there, less so vertically between efficiency and economy. And then conversely, we see a program like work program, which is delivering more in terms of efficiency, less so in some of the other domains. Okay, and if we could move on. So to try and summarize that, what we're working through is this ongoing process of kind of trying to recognize that we're still experimenting in building and managing public policy markets, but we often don't acknowledge, in our view, sufficiently the variation and also some of the tensions inside that around objectives, around design, the means, and also the outcomes, what we've talked about as the ends. And we want to encourage more of that heterogeneity and internal tension to be pulled out. That's what we're driving towards. In terms of these UK specific programs, we can clearly see that we're not fully utilizing across these programs their potential, and that we see a degree of shrinkage between the space of aspiration, what the policies would like to do, and then their traction in reality. And particularly inside that, with respect to broader aspirations, and then a tendency in the UK context to lean more heavily on the financial lever in reality in terms of what actually pulls through. There seems to be a suggestion just from this very small sample that we want to explore further with other programs in the UK and internationally of 3 different groups in terms of policy ends and outcomes: an efficiency heavy set, an effectiveness heavy set, and then a much tighter, narrow, but more balanced in FND. And one of our interests as we build further empirical work is to see whether these stack up consistently over time. There's a real question about whether the perfect optimal balance can potentially be delivered, or whether it's just possibly there's too much tension internally to deliver that. And then for us, there's a real final question about that comes out of this 2 decades of UK programs as to whether we're actually evolving, whether we're progressing, or whether we're merely iterating. So there's a real question. We see variation across all of those dimensions, but are we systematically learning, developing, and improving, or rather iterating and bouncing around? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, Al and Adam. And now we're going to hear some brief commentary from 2 of our kind of guest commentators. And we're going to start with Richard Johnson, who's going to lead off, and then we'll go to Ava Thorpe-Shaw.
Thanks, Carolyn. So I was asked to give you a slightly different perspective in terms of a very operational viewpoint on this. I've been working in outcome-based contracting for the last 20 years, mostly in employment-related programs. For 12 years in the UK, I set up one of the first employment zones. I set up and I ran what became Indius, and I set up and ran Serco's welfare to work business. For the last 8 years, I've actually been working internationally, mainly as a senior consultant for the World Bank, and latterly as a senior advisor for the Global Fund. So right now I'm working with the Global Fund to look at how we can utilize contracting to increase the impact of health services on the 3 diseases of TB, HIV, and malaria in a range of different countries in a range of different ways. I'm also chair of a youth employment program in Palestine, which is a development impact bond. And I'm chair of 3 impact bonds here in the UK, which are have the social investor of Bridges. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk to you first of all about something which is not employment and skills related at all. This is some results that have recently come out of some health contracts in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, post-Taliban, when the World Bank and others went into the country and wanted to establish health services, they found there was no public sector services that they could utilize. And in order to roll out basic and essential health services across the country, they had to contract with NGOs, international NGOs or local NGOs. And that continued for 15 years and continued very successfully. The health outcomes in Afghanistan compared with other countries were pretty good on some measures anyway. But there was also a lot more that could be done. And I was engaged 3.5, 4 years ago to work with the team on how we might revise the contracts with the NGOs to make them more results focused, to deliver more performance on them. And what we introduced were some activity-based contracts, not strictly speaking outcome-based, but activity-based. So the NGOs are paid on the basis of the 11 indicators that you see on the left. There's a unit price for each one of those, and each time they do one, they can claim it. So the more antenatal visits that they do, each quarter they can claim more money for more antenatal visits. You can see on the right-hand side the percentage change in these services from 2017 to 18. That was under the previous contract. Under that contract, they were essentially paid a budget reimbursement model. So they won the contract competing on price. They had to set out in detail what their budget was going to be. It was very input based and very heavily prescribed. And then they were reimbursed on a quarterly basis on that base, for those costs. And from 2017 to 2018, you can see how their performance shifted. We then introduced the activity-based contracts, and you can see the change from 2018 to 19. A significant change in the level of performance across these 11 indicators. We selected these 11 because I asked the health experts to give me a small number of key indicators which would act as a sort of thermometer for the health service as a whole. If we do more of these, we should get a more healthy health service. Could you go on to the next slide, please? So here we have some indicators which are not rewarded under these Sehat Mandi contracts. The health providers are not paid on the basis of delivering these. You might expect the performance on these to decrease with the service providers focusing on the indicators that they're paid for. But again, you can see over on the right, the percentage change under the old contract, the percentage change under the new contract, and a significant improvement across a whole range of different health services. My point here is that the way that we utilize contracting, the nature of that contract can have a huge impact on both the quantity and the quality of the services that are implemented. Next slide, please. And when I go into new countries and new contexts, and I'm looking at designing a contract of some sort, these are the sort of questions that I'm looking to ask. And these are the questions that I asked in the design of those health service contracts. The key one, obviously, is what is performance? What does success look like under this program? In some places, this is viewed bizarrely as a contentious response, but under an employment program, success generally is people getting jobs and staying in those jobs. Certainly in developing country contexts, it's as simple as that. How then are you going to incentivize as much of that to happen as possible? And I actually want to incentivize this to go further and further. I need to understand the existing context in which this happens. And I need to understand cash flow in the system. You know, when you get round to implementing these things, it is about operations and it's about basic commercial considerations. We got this wrong in Afghanistan. So we shifted the contractors from their budget reimbursement to an activity-based contract, and they had insufficient cash to cover their expenses for the first 6 months. There should have been some sort of cash injection up front to enable the transition. It's one of the functions of an impact bond. I'm often challenged on the tension between quality and quantity. If we push for a larger number of something, then surely quality will suffer. If you define your outcome carefully enough, if you define your success carefully enough, then quality and quantity will be two sides of the same coin. I don't just want someone to go into any old job. I want them to go into a job that is sustained and sustained for a significant period of time. And actually, before the government in the UK started to screw things up with the work programme, we were starting to argue that an employment outcome should actually include progression in employment as well. So an increase maybe in salary, a development in that employment. We need to capture the data. We need this to be verified, a key challenge often in developing country contexts. In this whole process of contracting, we've got the contract design, we've got the procurement process, and then we've got the performance management of those contracts. And this is absolutely key and cannot be underestimated and is often forgotten. And in Afghanistan, I'm not sure we got this entirely right. So right now, we have quarterly reporting from all the service providers on precisely what they're delivering in every corner of the country. We don't have performance reporting from the Ministry of Public Health on how they are performing in their management of those contracts, and we should be doing so. Intermediaries can address the issue of cash, and they can also address capacity issues in the commissioner. One of the things that you outsource when you outsource to an intermediary, to a prime contractor possibly, or to a bunch of social investors in an impact bond is their capability to performance manage. If the provider fails, we fail. We have to accept that we have a role as the stewards of the market. Next slide, please. I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you about this, but I talked about how the activity-based contract in Afghanistan had a significant impact on performance. Outcome-based contracts, in my experience as provider of these, can have a really significant and a real significant driver in both the quantity and quality of what is delivered. It has to be a good outcomes contract. You know, we often get these wrong. When you get it right, it changes the way people talk about the service. It makes them talk about performance. It increases the quantity and the quality. It gives you value for money because, and this is sort of a mantra of mine as I go into conversations in countries, is you want to attach the money to what it is that you want to buy. If you want to buy jobs, then that's what you attach the money to. And the more jobs you get, the more value you get for your money. If you attach the money to a bunch of inputs, such as training, and you have a whole bunch of training programs, but no one actually gets a job, that's not value for money. Significant donor fatigue at the moment in developing country contexts. If the donors see their money being attached to the results, they're more likely to invest in it. It's easier to see where the money goes, and it's easier actually to mitigate the risk of fraud because the money's tied directly to the result. And if you're going to deliver that result as a provider, I have to understand the individual needs of the person on my program. It forces me to deliver something that listens to the individual and takes account of the local context. And it gives me the room to innovate. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the last of mine. Of course, things go wrong in contracting. And I see these time and again. The biggest of them is that everybody seems to forget that there is a direct relationship between the money that you put in and what you get out of it. And you've got to understand this relationship. If you're procuring something, if you're procuring a caseload management model in an employment program, you've got to understand the implications of a caseload of 30 job seekers versus a caseload of 200 job seekers, and the relative cost of those two things and what it means for the outcomes that you will achieve. This is part of the commercial naivety of often the commissioner and sometimes the provider, because the providers don't necessarily build these financial models. And so many times I see the commissioner, particularly in the UK, think that they can push through a procurement process, identify a service provider, and have them begin that service in the space of a month. Renting officers, plugging in the IT, telephones take 3 months to plug in, you know? You can't do it in a month. And if you give me a contract that only runs for 12 months, I'm going to take 6 to 9 months to learn how to do it. The contract has to have sufficient scale to it. Price competition is a complete nonsense, I'm afraid. A complete and utter nonsense. It broke employment services in the UK because they applied it overly aggressively through the work programme. The example that Elle gave of the probation contracts was all down to a failure to recognise the connection between spend and delivery and the use of price competition. People say very rude things about organisations like Serco or Capita, the big outsourced providers. They are simply the products of the way that contracts are let, the way that contracts are priced, and the way that contracts are then managed. Often the price is wrong, and we see all the consequences of that. We've already had reference to creaming and parking. The best way to mitigate creaming and parking, I think, is to make sure that you are targeting very closely at the group of recipients that you want this service to be delivered to. So in employment terms, in the UK, your public employment service is brilliant dealing with people who are 0 to 12 months unemployed. At 12 months of unemployment, you probably need to refer those people out to something that is more intensive and results focused. If you targeted that group, you mitigate your risks of creaming and parking. Commissioners want to think that they're controlling everything, that they can control all of these inputs, which does not allow for the service to focus on the results, to focus on actual delivery. And I've talked already about us having inadequate performance management in the Commission or wherever that sits. You can spend as long as you like saying that contracting doesn't work, that outcome-based contracting doesn't work, because these things go wrong. These things also go wrong in services that are directly funded and run by the public sector. In fact, they're more likely to go wrong in services that are directly funded and run by the public sector, because it becomes very difficult to introduce a focus on results and some effective performance management tools when you don't have some separation of duties between commissioner and provider. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. You added a lot to an already full discussion, lots of issues we're going to have, but we're going to hear from Abna Thorat-Shaw first, and then we will get to Q&A and some, I'll try to pull together, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the chat as well.
Just thank you, Carol. I'm just going to preempt the Q&A because my role is to pose some questions to all the academics from a practitioner's perspective, and then hopefully it can stimulate the academics to ask questions which are much more intelligent than my most simple, way of doing it in the field. I'll start with so firstly an introduction to myself. My name is Abha, and I work at the British Asian Trust. We have led one impact bond in India in education. I think it's the largest in education in the world, and currently designing an employment one with the government of India. Again, a very large one in India. You work in the hundreds of thousands always. The fact that we're currently working with 30,000 people is seen as a small program. Scale is a massive issue for us in every question. So some of your contexts are very different from mine because I have to think about 1 billion people and 30,000 and what that means to government of India there. So it may not be relevant, but I'll start with my feedback from a practitioner perspective to Alex first, then to Alex, and then I'll try with Elle, very difficult. With Richard, I always agree with everything he says, so very difficult to contradict him because I come from the same place. But I will start with Alex. Alex, the question you asked is a really interesting one, whether by focusing on jobs alone, do you then create disincentives to meet the needs of the most marginalized, is how I read your question. And it's a question the National Skills Development Corporation asked us too, that if we want to mobilize the most marginalized people and we aren't able to get them into jobs, but the pure process of mobilizing them into those skilling providers enables them to have better life chances, why wouldn't we do that? Why would we only focus on jobs? And so my challenge to you on that is, it's a great question, is a simple answer, is you could be designing two kinds of bonds. You could be designing an employability bond, maybe perhaps to your needs as you described it, or a livelihoods bond where it is about jobs, or a jobs or livelihoods bond. And depending on how your theory of change works, the entire incentives are different. So perhaps what you're seeking within a livelihoods project is an employability answer. And that's where some of the tension is coming. And we've had to think that through in an Indian ecosystem where jobs, we need to be measuring jobs, but the ecosystem has focused on employability. And the problem that has created is a bunch of corruption in the market. And so we are having to look backwards and say, how do we clean that? So that's a challenge to you, and just to think about that. So moving on to Alex, I think is the question of, if you have skin in the game, are you going to sell soap because you make soap? Is the question you're asking us as practitioners. Yes, you will do that. The question I ask myself all the time is, if I didn't have skin in the game, would I bother to go to the last mile like I do? Because it takes a lot out of you to design an outcomes-based contract. And to keep yourself committed to that, despite all the odds that hit you, requires a certain degree of patience and resilience that I haven't seen myself need in a grant program. Then how do I make sure I don't have disincentives creeping in? So there is some skin in the game required to take it to the point, but there should be enough other partners sitting around you, and hopefully those are the outcome funders or other project partners, which enable you to keep asking those difficult questions. as against the intermediary alone having to take that role on. So you build in the checks and balances from that group. And ideally, a good outcome funder should be asking those hard questions, while you as an intermediary who have skin in the game to see and work your way through the problems are able to provide a counter solution to why it might work. So I don't know how that answers your question, but I'm thinking through how do we build in the solutions while putting intermediaries in a place where they do have skin in the game to deliver the program or the SIB. Unless you do, one of the questions was that came up was if SIB is seen as the only answer as against one of the many answers towards a problem. So let's say the government of India wants to get more people into employment and they ask for a call for proposals for all sorts of solutions, not just SIBs. That might be a more fair way of doing it. But the real world works very differently, unfortunately, and that's not how it works. So very difficult to answer that question clearly, but I was thinking through the psychology of people like us who are intermediaries and how we get committed to that program and how do we ensure we don't do the wrong things. I'm going to stop there and hand over to others to respond, but 2 responses to the first 2 presentations.
Sure. So why don't we let the presenters first respond to Abba and Richard, anything that you would like to, and then we'll draw out some of the questions from the chat and open it up to more questions.
All right, were you happy for me to get started? Okay, thank you, Abba. That's a really interesting reflection and really important. I think one of the things I saw, and this is interviewing over 50 stakeholders in both Toronto and New York, one of the frustrations for providers there is not that they don't want to focus on getting people into jobs. They absolutely do. But the issue is that separating out services that focus only on jobs from services that tackle the actual barriers people are facing is making it very difficult for contractors to work with people who need sort of like stepping stones or scaffolding to employment. So I think the way I see it is that the challenge for designing impact bonds or contracts, or even the challenge for designing government services, is how do we allow providers to work together effectively in ways that are rewarded and incentivized by our contracting models to get those steps in line. So if I am a single mother who is struggling with literacy and with housing, yes, I want a job, and we live in a world where a job is, still considered primarily the best way out of poverty. But in order to do some training to address my literacy gaps, to do some training that fits with an industry that will hopefully employ me at a good wage, I first need help addressing my unstable housing. And I need help sorting out childcare so that I can participate in that training. And so I think, I suppose the nice thing of being an academic is I get to fantasize about how things should be. And it's my responsibility to drag myself back into reality. But it's about how do we make sure when we're designing contracts that we're not creating barriers to providers working together? How do we allow them to see their goals as aligned for these individuals who need these kinds of support? And how do we actually incentivize them to work together in their planning for individuals, rather than saying, if someone's working with this group here, then they cannot be counted for this program here, which is one of those issues in particular. I'll leave it there. I could talk about this all day.
So Alex, let me follow up just a little bit, because this ties into some other issues. So for example, Elle and Adam talked about the kind of equity, effectiveness trade-offs and things like this. And so you contrasted 2 different, in your 2 different case studies, Toronto and New York. But for example, in U.S. employment training programs or workforce development, as you said, we now talk about it. In the past, we had performance standards adjustments, right? So where you adjust the standards so that their expectations aren't as high for people who may have greater barriers to services. And for example, in the Netherlands, they also in the past have done something where they've allotted different size monies or awards to contractors. So if you're working with a specific client group that has more barriers, you would be given more resources, kind of reflecting what you were saying. Well, this person might need other services in order to be able to get on the track to being finding stable employment. So, and I don't know to what extent, and others might chime in on this, is, how are we thinking about that in the SIB arrangement, outcomes-based contracting? Because I know my own study of this issue is surprising how we don't do enough systematic kind of performance standards adjustment, recognizing how kind of rampant the cream skimming issue has been. So I don't know if you or others want to comment on that. We do have a pretty broad range of tools for doing that. And are we just not doing it enough? Is there not enough attention to this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think you're right. We have great tools for this, and they're not always being implemented. I don't want to always give government the easy cop-out card, but sometimes this is a matter of funding, right? So in New York, the workforce development system in the city was overhauled or rebranded in 2014 towards a career pathways model, which was meant to say, hey, let's look beyond that entry-level job at a CVS and look at that scaffolding up from there, which is great. But that does mean that the government focus and government funding shifts towards that goal, and we forget about the other side of the goal. We know that in any design, be it within government or without, what is capturing the attention of designers at the time matters a great deal for the system. So I don't know the answer, but it's something about thinking about what the unintended consequences are a lot of the time of those SIBS designs. I think there's a lot of room for great work to be done there.
I saw Richard chimed in the chat, and so did Nigel Ball, and I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that issue.
Caroline, I'll just comment on this notion of how you align goals, or how do you align services around the individual? Because we see all of these silo-eyed services, we see individuals failing because the services are delivered in those silos. How do we get stuff integrated around them? It seems clear that the best way to do that is to focus on the result, is to focus on the outcome for the individual. Some of those silos are not actually relevant for all individuals. It's a different mix of silos for different individuals. And you need the service to be designed around those individual needs. In employment, we're incredibly lucky, okay? Trying to design outcome-based contracts in other contexts can be really difficult. And some of the DIBs that I see being developed, I shudder at, I'm afraid, because they're trying to measure some impact, which is years away. Here in employment, we've got an outcome, an impact really, but a very strong personal outcome, which is really, really close to the intervention itself. We've got very clear, obvious attribution. We've got very clear and obvious ways to measure it. We can understand and cost this theory of change very, very clearly. So our outcome is employment. Then we've got to recognize that a whole bunch of individuals have a whole bunch of different needs, some of which are very, very acute and will require a lot of money spending on them. So if you've got someone who is long-term unemployed, long-term unemployed, living a very chaotic lifestyle, they may need something like an intermediate labor market, which when they were first introduced 20, 25 years ago, were incredibly effective with the people furthest from work. They cost, £25,000 per person to achieve their outcomes, but they got there through delivering a very holistic and joined up approach. If you want to encourage and enable that joined up and holistic approach, you attach your money to the outcome, to employment, and then you can facilitate it as in your role as steward of that service provider market, but you need to allow them to gear and design their service around the individuals to achieve that outcome. I hate going around to these developing countries and seeing solutions that are designed in Washington or in London being imposed on these places, rather than enabling a system which designs a solution around the individual. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. Yeah, there's a kind of a commentary running in the chat too. So Milena mentions, and she's in an exchange right now talking about, our government's equipped, like you were just describing, Richard, to work with the most vulnerable populations. And clearly, I think one thing that has, played a role in is, as you just mentioned, how much money are we allocating to really provide a holistic delivery service? And this also raises the question of, again, the tension in the different goals, right? And financialization of a sector, this concern that, and again, it's a perception, right? A broad perception. It's been written about, and Alec talked about this, that as we financialize these, we will move away from those types of approaches. And, this relates to the keynote that was given yesterday too by David Van Slyke, where he talked about relational contracting. Is that if we bring in people who are closer to the vulnerable populations, better understand how to serve them, are willing to serve them more holistically, can we actually serve them effectively in a financialized contractual arrangement, or do we need to think about different arrangements? I don't know if Alec, you want to make any comments on this issue as well.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Abba, as well. And I wonder if, kind of responding to that, if I go back to Abba's question, actually, because I think that was a really, really good one about the checks and balances, and your belief that if the checks and balances are there, having skin in the game is not a problem. And I think what I was trying to get at in my paper, and one of the things I think about this financialization kind of approach, can perhaps be highlighted by the role of measurement in the social impact bonds, which I'm looking at. Because I agree with you, I think that kind of oversight and the checks and balances are important. But just quickly, let me tell you about what we found in terms of measurement. So we had 5 cases, 2 of them were very small numbers, so there wasn't much kind of focus measurement going on there. But the other 3 cases all had a real commitment at the beginning to doing impact evaluations to really assess what was going on here. All 3 of them had that early commitment, and the evaluators, as these kind of independent check and balance, all really wanted to deliver impact evaluations. But we didn't get that in any of those 3. In the UK example, the DWP, so that was the main government department, didn't give the data to the evaluators to allow them to do the impact assessment. In Switzerland, a decision was made by the local government to not do the impact evaluation, and also to change the metrics to make it easier for the provider to actually succeed and deliver on the impact bond. In the Netherlands, there was a general acceptance that the way they were measuring things was problematic. It was biased in favour of outcomes, but they continued with it because they didn't want the SIB itself to kind of fail. So we've got checks and balances built in, but they weren't drawn upon. And I think if we think about the reasons why, I think in Switzerland and in the Netherlands, with these being the first ever SIBs there, I think it was about political desires not to end up with any egg on their face. They really wanted this to be successful or seen as not problematic so they could grow the market further. I think the case of the UK is even more interesting in a way. And I think there's a kind of institutional belief in the rightness of this way of commissioning services, and something I think a kind of lack of curiosity about things which might disprove that. And I wonder if some of it goes back to the Innovation Fund report from 2018, which showed the lack of impact in some of these SIBs. And so I just kind of wonder if there's a broader institutional desire sometimes not to have those checks and balances, which is a thing I keep coming back to at this conference, about transparency, about more openness and better measurement. So, because I think if we did have those checks and balances, I think we'd have a better understanding of what's really going on.
Thanks so much, Alec. I know LU indicated you want to weigh in on this issue as well, right? The equity efficiency trade-offs.
Yeah, I'm going to have a go at drawing some of the themes together. I think it was interesting what you were mentioning about performance standard adjustments, Carolyn. We know that creaming and parking it can be really problematic particularly in outcomes-based contracts, we know that providers might be incentivized to target support on easier to help and neglect those who are harder to help. And we do have tools to try and mitigate some of this. But I think what I find interesting is that there are important connections between just doing an outcomes contract and the wider ways in which the market is structured. And I think what Richard was saying about the work program and price competition is very interesting here. Under that program, the winners were the cheapest. It was very much calibrated as a market structure that prioritized low unit costs. So it doesn't matter how effective a service or intervention you have, if your costs were not low enough, you would never win on that contract, and you never even get to offer your service, regardless of its efficacy. And I think this then brings into some of the discussion around social impact bonds often being much smaller, often being developed over a longer time frame, where there's far more discussion around what is it going to cost to deliver an outcome for a person who has these particular characteristics or experiences. And so I'm interested in whether social impact bonds actually, they look hyper contractual, but the discussion and the building and the legwork to bring it together, I actually think might, possibly I'm deluded, I don't know, might relate to some of this relational contracting that David Van Slyke was talking about in the keynote, and that actually we price outcomes far higher and arguably more accurately in impact bonds than we do in other marketized arrangements. I'd be interested in if that resonates with anyone.
Do any of the other panelists want to jump in on that?
I'm not sure I entirely understand relational contracts, I'm afraid. It's sort of a relatively new concept to me. But I suppose what we're talking about is a more sophisticated approach on behalf of the commissioner, in that they recognize, I talked about it as their stewardship role. The commissioner has got to realize that a contract is not it's not some sort of aggressive relationship that they have to maintain and beat people over the head with. A contract is there to enable the service provider to give the commissioner more of what the commissioner wants to buy. And if the commissioner wants to buy more of them, then the commissioner needs to think about how they can help that service provider to do it. Is it through, sorry, Karen, carry on.
Oh, go ahead. I realized that, not everybody in the session may have attended the keynote and may not have this. I was just going to offer, then you can keep going, the kind of distinction that we know of in the literature. So the main distinction between the relational contract and outcomes-based contract is relational contracts aren't enforceable by a third party, for example, the courts. So it removes that legal kind of accountability in there, and is intended to build on. So for example, one of the arguments I made yesterday, my commentary, is that relational contracts might be an important foundation on which you would build a formal contract, a SIB, right? So all these service providers who may already have networks of referrals and the work they do to provide more holistic services, that might be really valuable type of they're relational, right? Now, the question is, when you build a SIB, do you formalize all of that? Do you financialize all of that? Or is there a way you can maintain a relational foundation on which you build a SIB that doesn't, bind everybody, all those providers or those networks, into a single financialized contract? And so that's where some of the kind of tensions come between relational and formal outcomes-based contract. Can the two work together or not?
I would just throw in there, from the viewpoint of a service provider, I don't trust you, the commissioner, I'm afraid. Give me a relational contract if you like, but I need something that's in the law, because I need protection from you, because you do weird things at times. You come along and require me to do a whole bunch of weird stuff that actually stops me delivering the results that I'm supposed to be delivering, and I need protection in my contract from that. Notwithstanding the fact that I would like to have a proper relationship with you where we're both focused on maximizing those results.
Excellent. I'm going to call on Keys, who raised his hand, I believe. Do you want to unmute and join? I can't see your, there.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, about the relational contract. Let's say one of the leading economists who got the Nobel Prize on incomplete contracts, Oliver Hart, last year in the Harvard Business Review, he introduced the formal relational contract, as he calls it, and it is very practical. It's a five-step approach, and it ends, Richard, as you would like it to end, with a formal contract. But before signing the formal contract, you have gone through 5 steps, which are about building trust, which are about principles, which are about talking about the different goals, etc., etc. And so it really ends in something which you can bring to the judge. But before that, a lot of work has to be done, other than just signing a contract with people who you don't know, or with whom you would be sure that you would get into trouble with. It's last year in the Harvard Business Review. It's a very interesting piece.
That's an excellent.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
I have to say, in the UK, the Department for Work and Pensions, between the years of 2000 and 2012, they developed an incredibly relational approach to their contract design. They engaged with service providers, they co-designed the contracts, they co-designed the services. It was only post-2012 that a very different culture was introduced into the department that shut down that relationship, which then forced both sides into this confrontational approach.
Yeah, one of the themes that came out of the discussion yesterday was this issue, and I think, Keys, you probably can say more about this, but the idea that you're building trust among the parties, and that was something you said, Richard, too. I'm not going to trust it unless there's this formal arrangement. But in this case, we're looking at as Keys is describing, you're making sure you have these trusting relationships undergirding the formal contract. And then hopefully you end up with a better formal contract because you've had these processes which people discuss and understand, maybe the competing goals and incentives and different, or as everybody in the panel was describing, you're all studying different contexts, right? There's different political structures and culture and socialization that can also affect. So there really is no one way to do it. And maybe that relational process in advance of the formal contract sets you up for something more likely to succeed, even if it's not guaranteed. All right, are there others who, if you raise your hand, it pops up and I can see it. Otherwise, I can. We're down to about I think 9 more minutes here or so. So we have time, I think, for another more robust discussion.
Carolyn, I just focus again. One of the things that we've talked about a number of different employment programs. Al sorry, who did it? Al and James, was it? In their presentation, looked at these different employment service contracts. A key point to remember in looking at those is that the employment zones were procured with fixed prices. All of the subsequent contracts started to introduce price competition. So the employment zones were procured with a fixed price, and they were procured essentially on the basis of quality and performance. They looked for organizations that could demonstrate they have the technical ability to implement these dramatically new programs. And they had those organizations compete in terms of, and what could you actually deliver in terms of the number of people that you'll get into jobs in these areas. Then they started to introduce this notion of price competition and completely broke it. There is an absolute dogma in the heads of procurement people that they must have price competition, and it's price competition that just pushes the services down to the lowest common denominator.
Thanks so much. Do others want to comment on that? Adam, yes.
Just a couple of things. Thanks, Carolyn. So one, I think, is the first thing I think is the importance of performance management inside this. So we as kind of academics, I suppose, tend to focus, and we focused a lot today on the design on the front end of these programs. And then there's this, which Richard has alluded to, this critical space, both on the commissioner side and also on the on the provider side around performance management and the quality of that. So there's a real question for me as to if we take both of those spaces, design and performance management, and think of them separately, are they necessary or are they actually sufficient? So I think we can try and perfect design as much as we can. And clearly there are some things that are clearly wrong, but in my view, that would only ever be kind of a first step, if you like. It's necessary, but it will never be sufficient. And so I would see that inversely the other way around as well. We need good performance management, but it's very difficult to do that effectively in terms of your objectives if your design is kind of fatally flawed. So I think there's an interesting conversation there that we've perhaps neglected a bit on the performance management side. And then I had a challenge, I suppose, on integration. Because I think integration, this idea of, if you take the example of employment support, where you have a contracted jobs focused goal with, if you take Richard's example of people with more complex needs, a whole load of wraparound supports might be needed. That's okay in a contractual world, I think, where you're willing to suck up all of that wraparound support into a single contract and have a provider try and deliver it. But very often what you see is a contract around the employment provision and then a desire, understandably, to try and integrate that provider inside the wider ecosystem. And then I'm interested in views, there's a real challenge there in how you do that, how you try and reconcile that relationality in the web of wraparound and the bilateral contractualism between commissioner and provider. And there doesn't seem to me an easy way out of that unless colleagues have an easy way out, which I'd be delighted to hear. So if you take a financial route, there's a real challenge there about how you slice and dice the costs and the benefits, who puts in and how do those flows of savings and rewards come back from the contract. If you take a non-financial route and say, well, what we want to build is a team, is a network of aligned providers, well, then you've got a real contrast, it seems to me, between a financial logic as well as set of operations and cultures versus a non-financial, more collaborative relational model. So a way out of that integration problem, if you're trying to integrate in ecosystems, I think is a real challenge.
I think the way to integrate there is to introduce the role of a prime contractor. So I found when I was running employment programs that when I tried to put additional services into my employment service office, I couldn't do it because my frontline staff were too busy getting people into jobs. They couldn't decide who to refer to mental health support. They couldn't do the two things at the same time. And it was only when I stepped away from it and created a role as a prime contractor and separately commissioned my employment support and my mental health services that I could then make a decision as to who went to which assistance, where did I send to whom. And of course, this is what impact bonds can do when they work well, because you pull up to this level, effectively a prime contractor, you sit risk at this level and focus this level on a big impact, a big result, and you look for that level to then decide, how do I break that service down into chunks? And how do I make sure that they integrate around the individual that I have to achieve this result for?
Okay, we're down to our last 4 minutes. Is there any others that want to weigh in, or anyone else who didn't get a chance to respond to Abba's comments, or anyone else in the audience?
I think Deborah is trying to raise her hand there, Carolyn.
Deborah, who's trying to raise her hand, why don't you go ahead and take the floor? Can you unmute yourself? Can someone unmute Deborah? She says she's unable to. Oh, there we go. Let me see. Okay, I'm try again.
Oh. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say something to the last point. I think that I've lived and worked and studied labor market integration programs in the UK. And now I do so in Switzerland. And what you're describing to me, there's different, of course, there's always different solutions to one single problem. And what you're describing about this, people focused, frontline workers focused on getting a job and not being able to refer to other supports. When I observed labor market programs in the UK, the social workers had a lack of professional trust with structured work days and limited control, I would say, over their workplace. And what has been striking in the move to Switzerland is that they're regarded as professionals with flexibility. And so you might see social impact bonds as one way to get around that problem. And I agree it's a problem. The social workers I worked with had like their hands tied in the UK. But there's many different ways to get at that. And in Switzerland, I think they try to do it without financialization, but with what I would call professionalization. So I just wanted to point out, I think that SIBs have a way of maybe highlighting problems in systems, but there often are different ways to fix those problems, maybe that are more direct.
I wonder too if that might also be related to a culture issue, because, you know, SIBs do have this provision, you know, outcomes-based contracts is supposed to defer to the professionals and their discretion, and, you know, be less focused on process, although as we've talked about, there often still are some process measures. But that was, I think, an intention. But again, whether or not there are different ways they get implemented and the kind of cultures that are created within offices, maybe something, you know, along those lines that also affects the differences between the UK and Switzerland. I don't know if anyone else with more knowledge of things in the UK wants to comment on that. Okay, well, we are actually at 10:30. We'll leave that question for everybody to continue to ponder. We're at 10, or I'm sorry, I'm in Central Time. So we're at the end of the session. Thank you so much to all the panelists, those who contributed discussants, and those of you in the audience who stayed with us throughout the session and provided so much rich discussion in the chat as well. We hope this continues on throughout the conference. So thank you so much for joining us.